Homestuck is a story unlike any other. What other webcomic has 4 hours of animation and over 8 hours of games? Over its 8,000 pages, Andrew Hussie created worlds and characters not found in any other stories. I've been a fan of Homestuck since 2016, where it instantly became my favorite story. Since then, I've read it 5 more times. What I've always wanted was a comprehensive breakdown of Homestuck. Someone to look at it piece by piece, trying to understand what aspects are good and bad in order to determine its quality. And although there are many great Homestuck series on YouTube, none fill this strict requirement. In fact, few videos go into the negative aspects of Homestuck. Maybe people just have rose-tinted glasses, which blinds them from the issues, or maybe they would just much rather focus on the positive. Regardless, that isn't good enough for me. You can't appreciate how good something is without understanding what makes things bad. And if no one is going to break Homestuck down to try to understand how good or bad it is, well, it might as well be me. Of course, I wouldn't be surprised if many people watching this right now have never heard of Homestuck before, so I'll give a brief summary. Homestuck is a story about 4 internet friends that play a game that destroys the world. It transports them to a mysterious realm known as the Medium, and on their journey to understand their situation and master their powers, they are contacted by a group of aliens who played the same game and won. But due to an action the 4 will make in the future, the aliens were prevented from taking their prize. It's integrated with a unique form of time travel that permeates every aspect of the story, creating a wide range of situations, from lighthearted silliness of someone arguing with their future self, to characters knowing true futility as they see their future self die before their eyes.
Now, if you've somehow found this video and haven't watched Homestuck, worry not. I will supply sufficient context so you understand what I'm talking about. But I will spoil the entire act, so I would prefer if you read it before continuing. So here are a few places you can read it.
You could go to homestuck.com, which is the main site. Or, if you're one of those types that hate reading, you could watch the nearly finished Voxus dub on YouTube. But I suggest using the unofficial Homestuck collection. It re-implements the removed Flash animations and games, allowing you to read Homestuck as it was intended. This isn't to mention the new Reader mode, which will hide spoiler content until you get far enough in the comic, and restores the retconned pages until they happen. That last sentence probably didn't make any sense to anybody who hasn't read Homestuck. It's the best way to experience it by far, and I wish it existed when I first read Homestuck, as it would have improved the experience. In fact, the author of Homestuck himself endorses it. He has it on his link tree, listed as the not broken version of Homestuck. So how will this video be structured? Well, I'm going to be going through Homestuck Act 1 plot point by plot point, analyzing everything. The points I discuss will be in order of appearance, so major points will be next to minor points. How big a point is should be obvious by the time I spend discussing it. By the end of this video, I hope to answer how well Homestuck tells its story based on the rules it gives us. Also, all music in this video is played at some point in the comic, either in the animations, the games, or the pages that just let you play some songs. And as one final note before we begin, I will be doing my best not to spoil any plot points past this act unless absolutely necessary, but I will use pictures from later acts. But they will be without context and will not show any pivotal events. I want you to read Homestuck, so I won't ruin the experience if I can help it. In fact, I have a whole section about why you should read Homestuck at the end, so stay tuned for that. So let's begin. A young man stands in his bedroom. It just so happens that today, the 13th of April 2009, is this young man's birthday. Although it was 13 years ago he was given life, it is only today that he will be given a name. What will the name of this young man be? The first page starts with a brief introduction, and I'm sure many Homestuck fans can't help but feel nostalgic upon reading it, but we already have a lot to talk about. This character, at this point in time, doesn't have a name. For a long time, until partway through Act 4, the comic was led by user-submitted commands. Readers would submit what they wanted to happen next, and Andrew Hussie would choose the one he liked the best. This system was a way for readers to interact with the story, and Andrew Hussey had enough options to lead the story in a direction he wanted to go. But eventually that changed, and the story needed to move in a direction that didn't match the user submissions. So it was discontinued. In order to integrate reader commands, Homestuck is written as a parody of text-based adventure games. At least at first. Commands at the bottom of each page could be looked at as the commands the player of a text-based adventure game would type in. This so-called player was originally the readers over 10 years ago. But now that the comic is finished, it becomes almost like a second narrator. So to make things easier to understand, I will refer to this second narrator as the Narreader, to separate it from the narrator, that is the black text below each image. To be clear though, the Narreader is just a name I created, so I don't have to say the reader commands from over 10 years ago. But of course, in reality, it's still Andrew Hussey, as he chooses between the many options submitted to him. He even said it himself in his form spring. The fans were only ever in control in a very limited way, and everything takes shape at my discretion. The readers over 10 years ago had only an illusion of control. In truth, the narrator and the narreader are one and the same. Now back to the first page. Like in many video games, the name of the main character is chosen by the player. This is fine, depending on the execution. So let's look at the wording of the narrator. It is only today that he will be given a name. This isn't a typo. In this universe, people are named on their 13th birthday. I feel like I don't have to say how nonsensical this is. That people live without names for 13 years. Imagine teachers trying to interact with their students. Also, why does the narrator get to do this, and not our hero's father? Most video games avoid this issue by retroactively changing the name, so that naming the character alters history. But Homestuck doesn't go this route, and it makes the world seem unrealistic. Now I'm sure some of you might be frustrated. After all, this is just a joke. I'm taking the name of this character far too seriously. Sure, it doesn't make sense, but it isn't supposed to make sense. Andrew Hussey wants this to be a light-hearted, silly story, and if logic gets in the way of that, well, who cares? There's no doubt in my mind that Andrew Hussey didn't care about making this and many things in the future make sense. And if you want to write a story like that, go ahead. There's nothing wrong with it. But the issue arises with Andrew Hussey's other goal. He wanted to make a story with stakes, and characters that we care about. Stakes and character arcs require logic, because we need to understand them in order to care about them. Homestuck is trying to be two contradictory things. If I wanted to, I could have written this critique with the opposite perspective, pointing out all the high-stakes situations, character arcs, and anything else that doesn't ultimately lead to jokes, and calling them bad because they take away from the funny nonsense. But if I was to do so, I would end up concluding that the story as a whole is far worse than a conclusion based on logic, because the majority of Homestuck is based on logic, so I will judge it that way. This will be done by looking at how consistent Homestuck is at following its own rules, from the laws of the universe to character motivations. You might still enjoy a story despite the inconsistencies, but the moment you discuss a story in any detail, logic is absolutely required to reach any conclusion that isn't solely based on emotion. It's hard to write a perfect story. Few authors succeed, but we should always strive for perfection, and truly appreciate those that reach for it, because if we reward mediocrity, then that is all we will get. Now where were we? Ah yes, our character doesn't have a name. Luckily at this moment, the narrator gives him one. Zeus Smell Poop Lord. First impressions are very important in stories. Even if you don't judge a book by its cover, you might judge it by its first page. From this you could come to the conclusion that Homestuck is an immature, silly story. But that isn't true at all. The story is silly quite often, but immature isn't a word I would use. This intro not only gives a false impression, but it also fails at something even more important: hooking the audience. Homestuck starts with a description of a room and a joke about poop. There isn't a mention of the magical game that the story takes place in, or a hint of time travel. You would have no idea what the story is about when reading this. What if Homestuck started with the Frog Temple crash landing, creating a mystery on where the temple came from? Or you could start by showing our heroes landing on Earth, There are many better options, but instead, we have a poop joke. Anyway, our hero won't be named Zoo Smell, and the narrator tells the narrator to try again. So the second name is entered, and our hero is officially named John Egbert. The next page starts with Your Name is John. Homestuck is written in the second person, so that you are the characters. It will say you do this, or you do that. This is fine in concept, but it will lead to issues as we will see soon. To avoid confusion, I will narrate as if it was written in the third person. So we meet our hero John Egbert, and we are told some of his character traits through narration. Every character in Homestuck is introduced with exposition like this. My guess is that this was Andrew Hussey's way of immediately letting the readers know about the character so that their suggestions will be more constructive, although we are still given exposition dumps on new characters after the suggestions are over. The thing is, everything relevant in this exposition is shown to us in this act. His love for terrible movies is prevalent throughout this act and the acts following. We know he is a struggling programmer from the books in his closet and the names of the programs on his computer, even if we never once see him program something. Him being an aspiring amateur magician is shown by the contents of his magic chest. He has multiple things that could be used in a magic act, as well as a book about a magician. But we never see John do any tricks, and in later acts he becomes more of a prankster than a magician, but his fondness for paranormal lore isn't brought up again, unless it is talking about his love for the movie Ghostbusters.
This description of John could be removed without consequence.
But this page isn't all bad. As with every character, we get to see their bedroom as we are introduced to them. You can learn a lot about people from what they have in their room, and this is no exception. The previously mentioned love of bad movies is shown by the many posters on his walls. The narrator instructs John to get his arms from his drawer. Homestuck's art style often doesn't draw arms on the characters unless they are being used, hence the narrator's request. To go along with this joke, after saying the arms are actually in the chest, a mouse cursor appears to remove a cake from on top of it to help John. This begs the question, what is this mouse cursor? The narrator says you pick up the cake, and John is referred to by name on this page, changing the perspective from second to third person. This page breaks the fourth wall, implying that we have control over the story. This isn't like the games we will see in the future. There is no option given to move the cake or not. Breaking the fourth wall isn't the issue here. It's saying we can do something we cannot. This can be confusing and potentially immersion breaking, and it won't be the last instance of this happening. Going back to the cursor, no characters comment on it, yet it can affect the world. It even appears a few more times, mainly in this act. It's obviously something that was added for convenience, but a magical hand that can appear out of nowhere and move objects would be very useful in many situations. If you want a magic cursor in your story, that's fine, but we need to know its limits, and why it won't help our characters in dangerous moments, because without that we have a big problem. Later on, we see it move items from John's inventory, so why can't it remove items from the inventory of one of the villains, depriving them of their weapons? Why can't it block attacks to save our character's life? Not knowing this can ruin the stakes. On the next page, John receives his fake arms from the chest, revealing that he had arms all along, and we are introduced to the Sylladex, Homestuck's inventory system. A Sylladex holds Chapchalogue cards that store items. It's something that every human is born with, and they seem to be able to interact with it with just their mind. The Sylladex system has a lot of important functions in this story, and it's introduced slowly in this act, so that the reader can better understand how it works, which is good considering how complicated it is. But once again, we have a problem with the wording. You Chapchalogue them in your Sylladex. You have no idea what that actually means though. Due to the second-person nature of this story, we are led to believe that John has no idea what a Sylladex is. But as we will find out, it is impossible to use anything without a Sylladex, so John's lack of knowledge doesn't make any sense. In a third-person story, the sentence could be altered to, John Chapchalogues them in his Sylladex. You have no idea what that actually means though, stating that we as readers are the ones not in the know. Looking into his magic chest, John finds some items, many of which are used in this act. the Beagle Puss, Magician's Hat, Smoke Pellets, Trick Handcuffs, Colonel Sassacre's daunting text of Magical Frivolity and Practical Japery, and a copy of Harry Anderson's Wise Guy by Mike Caveney. But two of the items are never used, the Blood Capsule and the Stunt Sword. In small amounts, unnecessary information isn't too bad, and in this case, it's a small issue. But Homestuck is a very long story, with lots of information to take in. Giving information that isn't useful to the reader, especially when they don't know it's useless, will make it harder for them to remember the important information when it counts. John Chapchalogues the act of putting something in a Chapchalogue card, the Smoke Pellets, and we see the full extent of his inventory. John's Sylladex can hold 4 items. We will talk about that later. John is commanded to equip his fake arms, but we are told that they are under the card that contains the Smoke Pellets, introducing us to another aspect of the Sylladex. The inventories have rules, known as fetch modi. John's fetch modus is based off of the stack data structure, a system where only the most recent card in the deck can be accessed. As John is a struggling programmer, it makes sense to me that he would base his Sylladex off of something from programming. If not that, then something else from his interests. But it does inconvenience him, as in this situation where he can't access the arms. On the next page, there's an advertisement for Andrew Hussey's previous comic, as well as a link to the merch store. There are other advertisements like these in the comic, but they are few and far between. John walks to his dresser and reads a note from his father, wishing him a happy birthday. Next to it is a poster his father gave him. John is told to nail the poster to the wall, which is the reason why there were some nails and a hammer on the ground. I don't know why he decided to place them on the ground rather than using them immediately, but whatever. After Chapchaloguing the hammer and nails, the stack overflows. This pushes the arms out of the deck and onto the ground, making that a second way to get items out of his Sylladex. As long as the item isn't fragile, of course. The next command is for John to squawk like an imbecile and crap on his desk. As much as I dislike jokes like these, at the very least it is set up. The previous page sarcastically says the next thing you do will probably be exceptionally meaningful. However, it's important to note that John refused to obey the command. The commands given by the narrator don't describe the character's actions. They are given to the characters subconsciously, and the characters feel an urge to obey. It's just one page, but it raises some very damaging questions. How much choice does John have? And how would he act if the narrator disappeared? We know John can resist commands, but that isn't enough. If the narrator is malicious, could it subtly influence John in a direction he wouldn't normally go? We need answers to these questions, because any influence over the wills of our characters can greatly affect stakes, because climactic moments are often stemmed from the choices characters make. Let's continue. John merges the hammer and the nail card into one card. Merging cards is something rarely done in the whole comic. John uses the hammer and nail card on the poster card, something that is done with the cursor we saw earlier. The cursor even places the poster on the wall. It's revealed to be a Little Monsters movie poster. At this opportunity, John examines his other posters. The first is Con Air, a frequently referenced movie, while the second is Deep Impact, which could be considered foreshadowing for the end of the act. After examining the calendar, we hear the name of the game that 99% of Homestuck will take place inside of, Sburb. The Sburb beta was released 3 days prior, but John is still waiting for it to arrive in the mail. This page also contains a link to a previous version of Homestuck that was made entirely in Flash, but due to the difficulty to produce, Andrew Hussey abandoned it, and the comic was restarted 3 days later. Sburb being 3 days late is just a coincidence. In the old version, today was April 10th, still John's birthday, and the game was still 3 days late. Something of note is that this is the first sign of how lazy the people behind Homestuck were when converting from Flash to other formats. Remember the cursor? In the older version of Homestuck, you actually did control it. You even got to move the cake from the chest to the bed. But after Flash died, the page was turned into a GIF, removing the interactions. In this case, it's more forgivable, considering it's not part of the main comic, but it's a harbinger for what is to come. as in the future, several Flash games are unplayable, despite what the instructions below them would want you to believe.
This is why I suggested using the unofficial collection. In it, all Flash games work just fine.
As one final command before moving on with the plot, John is told to eat more cake, but he's sick of it after eating it all day. No surprise given the number of cakes in his room. John goes to his computer as he notices a message from his friend. Upon doing so, we see John's desktop, which allows us to learn more about him. A desktop is much like a bedroom in that respect. The interesting background was made by himself, and with it we see he's a fan of Ghostbusters, and we can see programming files he made. Also on the desktop is the Typheus web browser. Each of our 4 main humans has a browser named after a mythical monster of some kind. This also matches the name of the giant monster that sleeps beneath the planets they will soon arrive on. But it doesn't have any more significance than that. It's just a very odd coincidence. John opens PesterChum, the chatting program that our characters will use, with his username Ectobiologist. He starts pestering Turntech Godhead, who I will refer to as Dave from this point forward. His name will be Dave in the future, once the Narreader names him, but until that point, he will be referred to as TG in the chat. As a chatting program, the character dialogue are just lines with no quotes or surrounding sentences, which makes sense. But since this is the only form of communication characters have, it can make things confusing in certain cases, because you'll be missing things like he said angrily, he said regretfully, etc., making certain sentences ambiguous on the emotion behind them. John and Dave talk about the Little Monsters poster John got for his birthday, during which Dave mentions that he has a bottle of apple juice, and John warns that the monster from Little Monsters might have replaced the juice with piss, an interesting choice for the first chat conversation. The chat concludes with Dave mentioning that he has 2 copies of Sburb, but doesn't want to play because it was slammed in Game Bro magazine, despite the fact that just a few lines later he admits that Game Bro is a joke. John also says that he will check the mail for his copy. John looks out his window at his mailbox. He sees the mailbox flag up and comes to the conclusion that the mail is here, even though that's a signal for outgoing mail, not delivered ones. This mistake is referenced several times as a joke. Also, look at the direction the mailbox is facing. That must be very inconvenient for the mailman. That's when John's dad pulls up into the driveway and takes the mail, which causes John to hesitate to leave his room, as he doesn't want his father to monopolize hours of his time. John notices Dave pestering him again, and the narrator states that the clockwork of friendship turns ceaselessly. A neat reference to the fact that Dave's class spect is the Night of Time, and his planet will be the land of heat and clockwork. Ignoring Dave for the moment, John turns to a CD rack, and we see our first game, although I would put game in quotes. You can mouse over the CD rack, which contains a bunch of Andrew Hussey's previous work, 3 of which are linked. We also see Ghostbusters 2, MMORPG, a Little Monsters game, and a Harry Anderson game. Besides more shameless self-promotion, this does fit John quite well. His love of Little Monsters is already established, and we have already seen the Harry Anderson book in his chest, and the picture of Harry Anderson taped to the bottom of the lid. We have also seen his Ghostbusters desktop background. After looking at his CDs, John turns to read Colonel Sassacre's daunting text of magical frivolity and practical japery, but decides against it, because he would have to Chapchalogue it first. So apparently, you can pick things up all you want, but to use it, you must Chapchalogue it. This raises a few questions. What does it mean to use something? I assume John read the cover. What's the difference between that and reading the inside? I'll talk about this later, but I have to say, I like that the book calls itself daunting. After accidentally Chapchaloguing his fake arms again, he answers Dave. In this conversation, Dave mentions TT, which is short for Tentacle Therapist, who I will refer to as Rose from this point forward, as that is the name the narrator will give her later this act, but until that point everyone will refer to her as TT, and after she is named, they will never do it again. They talk about their fetch modi. John has apparently never heard the phrase modi before, which is like never having heard the word hand. Dave laughs at John for using the stack modus, stating that he uses hash map, which is a whole other can of worms. In order to lower the number of cards in his deck, Dave suggests that John allocates his Strife Specibus. The Strife Specibus is a Sylladex that holds weaponry of a single kind. In this world, you can't fight something unless you use an item from your Strife Deck. It's completely separate from the normal Sylladex, so you don't have to put your weapons in your normal deck. With this system in place, you can avoid the inevitable problem of weapons being stuck under cards. John decides to make his weapon of choice the hammer, so he uses the fake arms on the cake to gain access to the hammer that he used to nail the poster to the wall. He allocates his Strife Specibus, meaning he will be using hammers from this point forward as his weapon. For some reason, he has never done this prior, and he decided to do it now of all times. It's almost as if he knows he is about to enter a world of monsters. John then Chapchalogues Colonel Sassacre's daunting text of magical frivolity and practical japery, leaving his Sylladex with only that and the smoke pellets beneath it. John looks at Game Bro, a parody of Game Pro magazine. It contains a review of Sburb, but the reviewer said he never even played it, and just gave it 1.5 out of 5 hats, because you couldn't thrash anything, which is completely false. John thrashes many a thing in Sburb. The second half is him telling a story about the time his friend broke his thumb. My guess is that this is a jab at shallow reviews that say little about what they're talking about, or at least you can't say that about me. John then creates a disguise using things from his magic chest, hoping to fool his father. This page links to a Google search of Beaglepuss, which currently contains images from Homestuck, several of which could be considered spoilers. While wearing an item, it is temporarily removed from the Sylladex. This is presumably how one would wear clothing, Chapchaloguing them and then wearing them. But there's a small inconsistency here. On this page, you would think that wearing the disguise frees up its card, but as shown a few pages later, John only has 3 cards to use. John heads downstairs and we immediately learn 2 things about his father: that he loves clowns and baking. Clown pictures and figurines are scattered everywhere, while a buttery aroma is said to be coming from the kitchen. This is the first mention of Betty Crocker in the comic, and a link to the wiki is provided. John also despises his father's clowns to the point of praying for burglars. John looks at the fireplace while misquoting Mark Twain. Misquoting people is a running gag for a while. John then throws the Game Bro magazine in the fire, which doesn't burn well because each Game Bro magazine is guaranteed to be printed with 40% recycled asbestos. For big ups to Mother Earth, yo! Time is also spent on John's grandmother's urn. She apparently died from something to do with a tall bookshelf, a ladder, an unabridged Colonel Sassacre's. John immediately topples the urn, which is odd because he would have to reach his arm above his head to do so. Not something that really happens on accident. Actually, could his arms even really reach that far? It's pretty high up, and he's still a foot or so from the fireplace. So after toppling over his grandmother's urn, John decides to add his father's pipe to the disguise and to open a present before cleaning it up. I guess he doesn't care about his grandma very much. The present has another fatherly note attached to it, and inside is a Harlequin doll twice the size of John. And after putting it on the couch, he finally gets around to fixing the urn. He fixed it by merging the cards containing the ash in the urn. The result is the ashes sprinkled on the urn. The ever-helpful cursor places the urn back. John decides to take a detour on his quest. He goes back to his room to grab the fake arms again. But on the way, he answers a message from Rose. This is our first conversation with her. You can instantly see how the personalities of the two bounce off each other. Rose asks if John has Sburb, very sarcastically calling it the game of the year, and saying that Game Bro is respectable. John responds with equal sarcasm. Then both of them proceed to jokingly insult Dave. It's a great start for understanding her character, much better than talking about apple juice. She then says that she knows that John is wearing a silly disguise. How could she know this for certain? Well, Rose has a latent psychic ability, so it makes sense that she would have some kind of sense about her friends. Using the frosting on the fake arms, John sticks them to the Harlequin doll. That's some frosting right there. John walks over to a burning piece of paper by the fireplace. This piece of paper was poofed into existence between pages. Why, you ask? To make a joke about Toblerone, of course. That was worth bending reality over. On the next page, it is burned along with the wrapping paper. When John is commanded to Chapchalogue the doll, we are told that there's a size limit on Chapchalogue cards. I wonder what decides this. Is it the modi? Or the character's physical strength? Well, I guess it doesn't matter, unless something is Chapchalogued 1,000 times heavier than this, and there's a point where being able to lift something heavy is useful. John looks at Colonel Sassacre's daunting text of magical frivolity and practical japery. In it, Colonel Sassacre instructs the readers to do the kind of things we currently see John doing, such as wearing a beagle puss. It's obvious that he looks to this book as inspiration for his pranks. In fact, Colonel Sassacre has already been mentioned several times. John often wonders how funny Colonel Sassacre would think the things he does are. John debates whether to search the kitchen or the study. He chooses the study, hoping his dad isn't there. He isn't, and on the desk is a physical Chapchalogue card. John will later use this to extend his inventory, and in the next act he will be given 12 more cards by his father. This raises a question. Why does John only have 4 cards if you can apparently go to the store and buy more? He sure never brings it up. It's not like it would help him be a better programmer. Not to mention that whenever he is given the opportunity to expand his deck, he does. The real reason is that Andrew Hussey wanted people to understand that if you Chapchalogue a 5th item, the item in the bottom card will fall out of the Sylladex, something that would be harder to demonstrate with hundreds of cards. John examines a can of peanuts. Apparently, John is allergic to peanuts and once played a prank on his dad that relates to it, although the details are left vague. John also switches his hat for one of his father's and contemplates adding another pipe to his disguise, but in the end decides that the first one tastes bad enough. When John tries to extend his Sylladex, he Chapchalogues the card, but it doesn't instantly expand the deck. He has to wait for it to be pushed out the other end. This not only delays the inventory extension, but also takes up space in the Sylladex. Then John plays a haunting piano refrain. Now this page isn't just a nice song, it sets up John's piano playing ability, something that is brought up much later on in the story. Before leaving the room to continue the search, John decides to play a game of 52 Pickup, which is a prank using cards. But he is the only one in the room, so he basically pranked himself. He did this without Chapchaloguing at first, or else there would be smoke pellets on the ground. Once again raising the question of what it means to use something. The punchline of this page is, the peanut gallery over there sure is getting a kick out of it. You are allergic to their scorn, which is a reference to the earlier mentioned peanut allergy. In one last effort to avoid his father, John decides to check the mailbox to see if his father left anything behind. Before leaving, he looks at the TV, which is playing a commercial. John leaves the house to check the mail, but sadly the mail is gone. Then we get our second animation. Wind chimes play in the background, and we are clued into John's mental state. So far, he has been mostly joking around, but at this moment he looks around his neighborhood and feels lost. He feels that something has been missing from his life. It's a side of John that we don't see very much of. This page is also where the title of this act comes from. The note Desolation plays. After misquoting Walt Whitman, the page ends with him feeling like it's going to be a long day. And it will. But the show must go on, and the narrator commands John to poop in the mailbox, which he refuses. This joke is very tone-deaf. We went from a somber tone to comedic with almost no in-between. It also has no setup. John then checks the car and sees a green box and envelope. His dad must have left it behind, but the door is locked, so he can't get it. As one final attempt to avoid his father, John peers into the kitchen window and sees something similar to what he found in the car. A red box and an envelope, but this time he can see what's pictured on the envelope. It's the Sburb beta he's been looking for. But the window is locked, so the confrontation with his dad is inevitable. Having tried all other options, John enters the kitchen. A circus song plays in the background, reinforcing John's view of his dad's clown obsession. We first see his silhouette, then his pipe, his hands, his hat, and a cake, before finally showing all of him. His dad is faceless, which seems to be a stylistic choice. All Guardians are like this, so there's no problem. It seems this animation is trying to build up to showing John's dad's face, or lack thereof. which is odd considering we saw his face in a picture a few pages earlier. John's dad removes a cake from his Sylladex in the middle of the animation for some reason. There's no cake when we first see his hands, then a split second later there is. I guess he heard John enter the room and is preparing to give it to him. John's dad sees through the disguise, of course. The narrator states that John believed this would work. Way to make John look like an idiot. Now we have our second game, but our first with sound. John and his father face each other. Well, maybe face isn't the best word. While the song Showtime plays, the animation of John playing the piano had the song Showtime piano refrain, which was a remix of the currently playing song. We are given two buttons to push, a grieve and a jur. This is one of the first examples of Andrew Husse's limitless love for alliteration. Something of note is that even though he uses many uncommon words, there is always context to them, so the reader will understand it. When you press a grieve, John attacks his father. John slams him with the hammer, but his father is unfazed. The definition of a grieve is to give pain or trouble to. When a jur is pressed, John's dad tries to give the cake to him, but John refuses. Abjure means to reject. When John is commanded to take the package and run on the next page, the narrator says he cannot abscond, which means to leave hurriedly. And we cannot forget strife, which is used instead of the word fight. This allows readers to learn words they might not know without ever having to look them up in the dictionary. One small note is that when you pick abjure, the phrase Guardian Rubric Cobblebrand appears at the top. It's not explicitly clear what the Guardian Rubric is, but it appears once more after this in Act 2 when Rose strifes with her mother. However, we just don't know enough to say anything too definitive. Outside of these two instances, there's only one situation where a guardian counters their child in strife, and that is Dave against his bro. Guardian Rubric wasn't shown, but he could have used it without us seeing it. During the fight, John uses his Beaglepuss to block a pie. He then Chapchalogues the pie tin, which pushes out the smoke pellets onto the ground. He was at first disappointed that they didn't activate, but after the cursor clicks the accede button, which means to agree to a request, he grabs the cake his father was giving, Chapchaloguing it, which pushes Colonel Sassacre's daunting text of magical frivolity and practical japery out onto the pellets, breaking them and filling the room with smoke. Using this chance, he grabs the red package, the beta, and his father's PDA. Now that he has the PDA, John can communicate with his chums on the go, although the reasoning given here is that John wishes to change the background as a prank, something he never does. After Chapchaloguing all of this, the blank card is pushed out of the deck, extending it. Now John has access to 5 cards. He leaves the Beaglepuss behind and exits the kitchen. On his way back to his room, John decides to Chapchalogue the cake that one of the fake arms fell into, after which he merges it with the one already in his Sylladex. But because the cakes were on opposite sides of the stack, everything in the Sylladex is merged.
But why? Why would you do that? Why would you do any of that?
What exactly are the rules for merging? Can you just do it with any 2 cards? Or do dissimilar objects have to be in between the merging cards for this to work? To fix the problem caused by the merge, John heads to the bathroom to do surgery on the cake. We are told about his dad's room, which he has never entered for some reason. Once in his bathroom, we see the backyard, which contains a slime pogo ride and a swing set. But there is not nearly enough room in the backyard for those things, considering the angle we can see them at, and the fence being so close to the house. This is a shame, because John's house is very consistent with its layout. Using a razor and a towel, all items are removed from the cakes, and John leaves the room with a cake in the toilet and a towel and razor in his Sylladex. He arrives in his room, and we get to look at the other 2 walls, showing even more movie posters. After looking at a few posters, it is revealed that John has an infatuation with Mathew McConaughey, as seen by the wall that is dedicated to him. John checks Pesterchum, and we get a small game. Maybe an activity is a better word. You can click on the taskbar and open up a conversation. It even has sound effects. Although this implies that when you get a message in Pesterchum, the program opens a window automatically in the background for each conversation. We first read a message from Garden Gnostic, who I will call Jade from this point forward, as it is the name that she will be given once we are introduced to her in Act 3, but until that point everyone will refer to her as GG, and after she is named, they will never do it again. The message is brief. She is looking for John, but when he doesn't answer, she stops messaging. There is no reason given for why John doesn't reply back right now. The next message is from Dave, who mentions that Jade is looking for him. In Act 2, we see a conversation between the two of them where Jade tells him about that. John references one of his movies, saying that a meteor is heading towards Earth named after him, more foreshadowing for the meteor heading towards his house. Dave comments on John's obsession with Matthew McConaughey. He calls the obsession unsavory, and mocks Matthew McConaughey for having a name that sounds like something a horse would say. Dave thinks the only way you would like Matthew McConaughey or Nicolas Cage is if you are doing it ironically. For example, Dave is wearing sunglasses once worn by Ben Stiller, but ironically saying, "I'm wearing them ironically because they're awesome." The fact that they're ironic makes them awesome, and vice versa.
You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
But after that, the subject switches back to Sburb. John is also told that Rose's internet is unstable, so he will have to wait for her to come back online to play the game. To waste time, John opens his Typheus web browser and goes to mspaintadventures.com, which was once the name of the website Homestuck was hosted on. After the comic was finished, it was transferred to homestuck.com, while mspaintadventures.com now redirects to it, but all reference to the original name in the comic remained. As a result, this joke doesn't land, as new readers won't know what mspaintadventures.com is. On the site, we don't see Homestuck, but a comic called The Midnight Crew. After that, John inserts the Sburb disk and the terminal appears stating that the client is running, and it's waiting for a server connection. We also learn that the company behind Sburb is called Skyanet, which is a homage to Skynet from the Terminator. This makes sense, as both companies bring about the end of the world, and time travel is involved. While waiting, John decides to familiarize himself with data structures, after Dave previously suggested it, as he seems to be struggling with the extremely basic stack data structure. While doing so, we see a few of this universe's programming languages, two of which we have previously seen on John's desktop. They all replace part of a word with the name of a symbol that makes a similar sound. For example, tell death, carrot cake, and disasterisk. There's also a book on discrete mathematics, which is the subject of the best math class I ever took, yet a very advanced subject for a 13-year-old to learn. The last book is called Autonoma, which I can only assume is a robot building book. John sure does like to challenge himself with hard subjects. The till death programming language is actually very important later on, even if all the programs are written in a different universe. So John decides to look at a rather angry book on data structures, but rather than reading it, he takes the fetch modus in the back. His current modus will only allow him to access the newest item Chapchalogue, making all others inaccessible until they reach the top. This one, the Q modus, will only allow you to access the oldest card Chapchalogued. This is a downgrade, as already established you cannot use any item without Chapchaloguing it first. This means that if you, for example, wanted to pick up a phone to answer it, the phone will be in the back of the Sylladex, requiring you to remove every other item before accessing it. But now there is a contradiction, because previously it was stated that you can't read a book unless it is Chapchalogued, and yet John reads the text on the fetch modus despite not putting it in his Sylladex. Doing so would have pushed the razor out. Maybe he could read it because it wasn't attached to the page, but that's never said. We need an actual definition of what it means to use something, because as of right now, it seems to be whatever Andrew Hussey wants it to be at the moment. Moving on, John is asked to put down the razor, and the narrator states that John doesn't understand what that means. Apparently, John doesn't know how to put items down, which... Is John mentally ill? For one thing, we have seen him put items down before, such as the urn cake and playing cards. So for what reason has Andrew Hussey clouded our character's judgment? Well, it's complete nonsense. John wants to open the red box with the razor, which means he needs to move them to the front of the queue. And because John has lost his mind, he can only do so by overflowing the queue. And it has to be the queue, because we are told that John never owned the stack modus card, which implies that he was born with it or something, which is just silly. So now that the scene is sufficiently contrived, let's watch as John makes a complete fool of himself. Using 2 cakes, he launches a razor out of his deck. It chops off a part of his hair, but don't worry, it will grow back on the next page we see him. The razor is now embedded into one of his posters. He captchalogues the book Wise Guy, launching the towel out, which defies the laws of physics by floating down like a leaf. The trick handcuffs jettison his father's PDA out the window. Now the box is at the front, but the razor isn't in his Sylladex anymore. It's embedded into the wall, so he has to put the razor back in. I mean, it's not like you can remove the tape with your fingers or anything. Putting it back in launches the red box out, making the box not usable either. To get the two out again, he captchalogues some broken glass. You know, I'm starting to think that the speed in which things are launched out of the Sylladex isn't very consistent. Just compare the arms to the book and PDA.
In most cases, the Sylladex will launch things to the corner of the room. Yet right now we have items launched out the window perpendicular to the house. And this isn't the only case of the directions acting up. Although in all cases, items launch towards the right side of the page, with the odd exception of in the bathroom, the right side of the page isn't always facing the same cardinal direction. In John's room, the view angle is different. The most obvious way to tell is by looking at the door. The door is on the left wall, both inside and out. Therefore, our view in John's room is flipped 180 degrees. And the items fly in a different direction than in the kitchen. You would think John wouldn't be making things fly out his window if he could control it. Which raises the question of what rules govern this universal system.
I'm also surprised that John's room wasn't destroyed when we found it at the beginning. All he's trying to do is open a box. Yet in the process, he launched 4 objects out his window, all within the span of a few minutes. Now you might argue that it's okay that he was bad at using it, because this is a different modus than what he is used to. But that isn't the case. The front of a queue is in the same place as the bottom of a stack. When you overflow a queue, the item pops out the front of the queue. And when you overflow a stack, it pops off the bottom. In both cases, you are inputting items from one side, and an item is popping out of the opposite side. When you cannot place items down, there is no difference between a queue and a stack. So even when he was using the stack, John should have been running into the exact same situation multiple times per day. I cannot see how John is able to function in his day-to-day life. With broken glass covering his floor and razor in hand, John opens the box.
I guess he remembered how to place things down. Luckily his delusions disappeared right when it needed to. Within the box is a stuffed bunny from Dave.
The same stuffed bunny from the movie Con Air. The same bunny that in this story will go back in time twice and get cloned twice. This bunny or its clones will be owned by every human main character except one, but he has an alternate reality version of it, so it's fine. Needless to say, this bunny gets around. Or it will get around. But for now, it's just a gift from Dave. The page also contains a link to a screenshot of the scene mentioned from Con Air. John's attention is averted by his computer as Rose connects. The terminal now says that a host is attempting to connect to him. How this connection was established is never explained. It would be cool if the characters exchanged IP addresses, but I know that didn't happen, because Jade will connect to Dave without him even knowing she had a copy of Sburb. John talks about his new bunny, and Rose says, "I've heard tales of this wretched creature often. Its Homeric legend is practically ensconced in the fold of my personal mythology by now. I'm not sure how serious this is supposed to be, but it's kind of literal, as the bunny she owns was given to her on the day she was born, and her bunny and John's bunny are one and the same, due to the aforementioned time travel. But finally, it's time to learn what this game is about. Epilepsy warning until I say otherwise. John and Rose connect, and the Sburb loading screen starts up with a fancy spirograph freaking out, with flashing lights in the background. Below is a loading bar with messages rapidly flashing. They number over 200, most of which are absolute nonsense. Referring time spools, recruiting drains, closing cogs, sewing mirrors. I assume this is a reference to The Sims, as they have similarly nonsensical loading screens. All the while, it plays a tune that I love. But the purpose of this page is to raise the tension for what is to come, the game that we have been waiting for all this time. We spent over 100 pages watching John fail at managing his inventory. Finally, it's here. Sburb. Epilepsy warning over. Sburb is a game where the server, aka Rose, can control the client's, aka John's, house, create and destroy rooms, and move objects around. It's basically The Sims in real life, at least at first. There's much more to it than that. I mean, nothing has even time traveled yet. Well, on screen at least. So we are given an interactive page or the control menu that the server player will use. Although we can't actually control anything with it, all you can do is mouse over things and you will get the name of it. But if Sburb was a real game, this would be the control interface. On the top left corner, there are some buttons, arrow keys to pan the camera, a magnifying glass to zoom in and out, and some arrows that are used to change which angle you are looking at. At the top there's a save, load, and exit button. The exit button makes sense, but the save and load button is odd. Does this mean that Rose can save the house and if she messes up, reload the save? It is never used that way, but if so, it would have been very useful in many situations. Across the top there are several options. The first three will change what happens when you click on something, while the last four are menus. Starting with the menus, the Finalia registry stores objects, either added by the server player or supplied by the game. The grist cache stores different types of grist, which are used for building in Alchemy. Alchemy is something we will talk about later. The last two, the Athenium and the Alchemy Excursus, also relate to Alchemy, so I will hold off on talking about them for now. Moving to the cursor options, Select lets you pick up and move things. Revise lets you alter part of the house, like extending a room, and Deploy lets you place items stored inside the Finalia registry. The control scheme seems to be designed to be usable with only one mouse button for some reason. Also, Deploy is redundant. None of its functions overlaps with Select. Select is already used to put things in the Finalia registry, so why not also let it take things out? Rose selects John's magic chest and moves it. She places the chest on his roof by accident. The finicky controls are a running gag in this comic. Under where the chest once was is John's stack modus. This allows him to essentially switch between it and the queue modus, allowing access to items on both ends of the Sylladex at any time. Unlike the queue modus, John was able to apply the stack modus without putting it in his Sylladex first. This plot hole allowed him to skip launching out all those blades of glass to get access to the card. Speaking of plot holes, we have another. It was previously stated that he never had the card for the stack modus, but now he suddenly had one all along, and somehow after he changed to the queue modus, the stack modus flew across the room and under his magic chest. The reason this happened is that Andrew Hussey wanted to force us to use the queue modus and learn how it works, then give us the stack modus back because it's Sburb time. Also, due to GIF compression, and yes, I pronounce it GIF, the ghost on John's shirt is blue in this panel. John's dad is shown leaving the house to buy more baking supplies. That guy sure does like to cook. I mean, he just came back from the grocery store when he got the mail. I wonder if he will notice the mail he left in the car last time. Also, I guess John's dad is perfectly fine with leaving John alone without saying a word. At John's request, Rose attempts to move the PDA that lays outside, but there seems to be a limited range around John which she can mess with. It's good that this is mentioned, as we now know Rose can't just control everything in the world. But we are still missing some information. Does this continue to work around John if he leaves the house? Because if so, it would make robbing banks pretty easy. Just walk into the building and put all the money in the Finalia registry. She also determines that she can't interact directly with John. Another important detail that is good to establish. So instead, Rose puts the bunny back in the box, a Con Air reference. Rather than John simply walking outside to pick up the PDA, Rose decides to use this chance to experiment with the Sburb controls. Using the Revise tool, she extends John's room so that he can get closer to the PDA. Now with more room, Rose looks into the Finalia registry. In it are three machines, the Totem Lathe, the Cruxtruder, and the Alchemeter. She decides to place the Totem Lathe in this new space. These three machines are used for alchemy, and how they are used will be shown to us this act. Rose explains to John that extending the room cost build grist. One of the many types of grist that I previously mentioned will be stored in the grist cache. As the name suggests, build grist is used for building. John started with 20, and expanding his house used up 4. Deploying the lathe, however, didn't cost anything, and the same will be true for the other machines. Rose concludes that it being free must mean the machines are important. After all, no matter how much a player messes up, they can still place those 3 machines. But what the machines do is up for the players to find out. When John asks to have a turn messing around with building, Rose tells him that he needs a separate server disk for it. John replies that he doesn't have it, but then remembers what he saw in his dad's car, so it looks like we'll have to wait until his dad brings the rest of the mail inside. But why were they even separated? We aren't given an in-universe reason. I mean, I've heard of games being separated into multiple disks, but multiple packages? This separation only exists for this situation, to prevent John from using the disk. His 3 friends never have this problem, despite their disks also being separated. What confuses me is that they had a perfectly good reason for John not to use his server disk on Rose, because he could be planning to use it on Dave or Jade, but that is never brought up. In fact, the only reason Dave is brought into the game is because John lost his server disk, and Jade joins without any of them asking her to. It's almost implied that John and Rose would have left them for dead otherwise. Now I need to talk about time travel for a bit. I feel I shouldn't have to say this, but I've read people argue this point, so I'll mention it. Some of you Homestuck readers out there might not like the previous section. John losing his disk is important. If he didn't lose it, a doomed timeline would have been created. You see, in Homestuck, the past and future are determined. Destiny exists. It's a bit more complicated and a lot cooler than that, but I won't go into unnecessary detail. But just so you know, free will still exists. With this in place, all my criticism about events of the story are null and void, because every event had to happen the way it did, or the universe would fall apart. And you'd be right, if Andrew Hussey was writing down events that actually happened. But no, Homestuck isn't real, and every plot point could have been changed. Saying it had to happen the way it did is just silly. Once John stands in the corner of the now extended room, Rose is able to reach the Wise Guy book and the PDA. Moving these things, as well as the bunny, costs no build grist. Afterwards, she focuses on the living room and places the Cruxtruder, not realizing it's blocking the front door. Finally, she places the Alchemeter on the balcony. Through this process, we see 2 more things in the Fernalia registry. A pre-punched card which will be placed soon, and a 4th machine called the Punch Designex, which costs some purple grist they don't have yet. The machine will be used in Act 2. When John is told about the machines, he asks a question many readers would also be asking. To what end? I mean, what are we supposed to be doing in this game? This raises an important question. How much did John know about this game before this day? He gives no indication that he knows anything about the game at all, which doesn't make any sense. If he knew nothing about the game, he would have no reason to be excited about it. We have no reason to believe that Skynet released any game prior, as Sburb wasn't programmed by them, but translated from hieroglyphics found on the walls of the Frog Temple, so there's no history to build hype on the game. So did Skynet reveal some of the game's capabilities? Well, that's never said. We could have at least seen John say, "Wow, it really works as they say, and Dad said it was a hoax." But we don't get anything at all. Looking at John's reaction, he acts as if this type of game is common, but considering how similar this world is to ours, we will need evidence of that. If the abilities of the game were publicized, I guess John's dad doesn't know about it, because if he did, I doubt he would have left the house after he saw John take the game upstairs. Let's continue. John looks at his dad's PDA. It has a messaging app called Serious Business, where several of his father's business associates talk about how to clean a tie that was accidentally dipped in coffee. We see this app a few more times in the story, and it will be very important later on. It's a little confusing to read, as the messages are ordered from most recent at the top to oldest at the bottom, while Pesterchum is the opposite. John installs Pesterchum on it so he can chat with his friends on the go. He has a chat with Rose where she comments on John's lack of regard for personal property in stealing the PDA and the mess he has been creating all over the house, concluding that this is the result of pent-up frustration relating to his father. John tells her to, "Please take your psychobabblary elsewhere, miss," giving us our first hint of Rose's love for psychology. Rose then says that she will try to clean up the cake in the toilet, which is odd considering the state of her room when we meet her. Why would she care about the cake? John examines the alchemeter, but is unable to see how it works. Then he looks through the telescope and looks at the sun. That's gotta hurt. In an attempt to remove the cake, Rose accidentally rips the toilet out of the floor. Unlike the bunny, PDA, and book, this action cost build grist, 2 to be precise. She reacts to this action by typing "whoops" into the chat, which would have required her to open up a different window on her PC to type it in, so she must have done it intentionally. Yet when John asks what's going on, she says everything is under control, and that John shouldn't investigate. If she didn't want John to know about the mistake, why did she type "whoops" into the chat? She places the toilet in the backyard rather than placing it back in the bathroom. I guess she couldn't do that for some reason. Usually in games like The Sims, removing things doesn't leave a hole in the ground. and you can place things into the ground without any issue. This is something that happens in the future. When Rose copies the chimney to make some pillars, she doesn't need to make a hole in the roof, and when she extends a ledge, the fence on that part of the balcony disappears. Sburb, in almost every case, has the convenience of The Sims, with the odd exception of bathroom appliances. How inconsistent of it. But I guess it doesn't matter, unless the inability to do this causes the climax of the act to happen. Upon finding the hole in the floor, John decides to use it as a shortcut to the laundry room. Not sure why. On the floor is a green Chapchalogue card and a sledgehammer. Beyond being green, this seems to be a normal Chapchalogue card. It isn't called a Strife Chapchalogue card or anything. But when John adds the sledgehammer to his Strife deck, it uses the green card up. But if adding weapons to the Strife deck takes up a card, then why didn't John lose one when he added his first hammer? After adding the new sledgehammer to his Strife deck, he gets a message from Jade. She asks if John has received the birthday present from her that was in the green box. He tells her that it is in his dad's car. They talk about Sburb, something Jade has never heard of before. This conversation ends with Jade investigating an explosion from outside her house. John enters the living room to see the Cruxtruder blocking the door. That sure is something inconvenient. I hope it won't become a critical plot point next act. Rose accidentally removes the bathtub, which costs 2 more build grist. I have no idea why she decided to do this. It's not like she was trying to patch the hole in the ground, because that requires the revised cursor, but I guess it doesn't matter, unless it causes the climax of the act to happen. Just like when she removed the toilet, Rose said something in the chat as if it was an accident. While John tries to use his small strength to open the Cruxtruder, the bathtub fails on its journey to the driveway, where it will be hidden, or something. Rose doesn't seem to be thinking that far ahead. Also, why the driveway specifically? I hope this isn't plot relevant. Rose dropped it after temporarily losing connection due to the failing power in her house. To prevent it from happening, she will need to find a stable internet connection. But to do that, she will have to confront her mother. She seems to have an interesting relationship with her guardian, one which is apparently filled with alcohol and mockery, compared to John's cake and gestures. But she holds off on leaving for now. John decides to use his sledgehammer to open up the Cruxtruder. Hitting it seems to be the only way of opening it. Even still, John isn't strong enough to lift the hammer, so Rose helps. Look at how accurately Rose is able to move the sledgehammer so that it isn't removed from John's hand. It's almost as if she is only clumsy when the plot needs her to. From the Cruxtruder rises the Colonel sprite, a blue flickering circle, and a display on the side of the Cruxtruder shows a countdown of 4 minutes and 13 seconds, the time being a reference to the release date of the comic. John asks what this means, and Rose looks at GameFAQs, a website that was a popular host of game walkthroughs. She determines that there are no guides that have progressed much more beyond this point, despite one of the guides starting on the day of release, 3 days ago. The reason for this is that they died from the meteor strike the countdown foretells, and we will talk about that in a minute. For now, let's look at what this implies. After 3 days, there is no documentation for the game past its first few minutes or so. Looking at the number of guides, I don't have a problem with it. I only wonder why Rose didn't look at other websites. I'd imagine there'd be a forum somewhere for the game, but regardless, there's something to say about the quality of the guides. The guides being so short is the result of the writer's death. With more time, the guides would be much more detailed. You might argue that a 4-minute countdown is so short that the length of the guides makes sense, but keep in mind that as we learn in the future, the countdown only warns the player of the meteor, it doesn't cause it to strike. This means that if John opened the Cruxtruder at a different time, the countdown would change to match. Which means that if John got the game on time, he would have 3 days to experiment with how it works. I guess he's just lucky that he had so much extra time. Or maybe the GameFAQ writers are just unlucky. But regardless, it's an unnecessary contrivance. Just make the story take place on Spurb's launch day. Having guides that short would be normal. John uses the wheel to extrude some Cruxite, hence the name of the device. Rose also places the pre-punched card, which looks to be a blue apple in a Chapchalogue card, but with holes punched in it. After Chapchaloguing it, John Chapchalogues 2 Harlequin figures to push the PDA to the bottom card. Giving him access to it while also launching shards of glass into his big doll. Despite how little is on the GameFAQs, some apparently say that the kernel sprite needs to be prototyped. How they came to know this information is never said. Even the name of the kernel sprite is never said until one enters the game. Yet somehow these people knew this information. The reason it is called prototyping is because the object you put into the kernel sprite will be used as a template for the monsters and royalty in the game that John is about to enter. They decide to use the giant Harlequin doll, the worst mistake the two of them will ever make in their entire lives. But the two know nothing of this. For now, they have prototyped the kernel sprite. The circle now contains a jester head and a floating arm, and it seems to be rather agitated. Rose explains that prototyping it a second time might help us understand its words. But John decides not to, despite the fact that it won't take more than 5 seconds. He decides to stop at the halfway mark. John assumes the time it would take prototyping would be better spent figuring out the game through trial and error. Who needs a game-supplied guide? It's not like there's a countdown or anything. His next step is to go examine the alchemeter again. After he got some Cruxite, an item appeared in the Athenium, which we now know is a library for all known items that can be created using carved Cruxite. But since this Cruxite is uncarved, the default item is added, a perfectly generic object. To get the Cruxite from his inventory, John Chapchalogues the telescope, launching the PDA to his neighbor's yard. John puts the Cruxite on the alchemeter, and the alchemeter scans it, creating 3 perfectly generic objects for the cost of 6 build grist. Alchemy is the second thing that costs grist. The reason he was able to create 3 at once is because the cursor interacted with a menu. There seems to be no other way to change the amount, but once the cursor disappears in the next few acts, the characters will still be able to make multiple of the same things. But while doing so, John sees something in the sky. With the help of his telescope, he sees a meteor heading straight towards his house. In Act 2, we are told that for the past 3 days, meteors have been striking people's houses. How in the world is John's dad able to just go to the store? They should be in bunkers right now, yet John is having a normal day. There should be world panic. Scientists can detect meteors thousands of years in advance, but these ones spawn from magic portals in the sky. No one knows when and where they will land. So what does John do in this situation? First, he gives the kernel sprite a high five, and then contemplates eating build grist as it looks like gushers, ignoring the fact that he shouldn't know what grist looks like since he hasn't seen any. These are some very odd actions for John to make in this situation. One could argue that this is an aspect of his character, that in tense situations his mind wanders. But considering the lack of similar actions in similar situations in the future, that doesn't seem to be the case. Moving back to the meteor, it's hard to say how fast the meteor is going, especially since in one page it seems to be going almost straight down, while in the next it's going almost horizontal. But considering there are clouds behind it, I think the time at the top of the page of 3 minutes and 10 seconds is a bit off. So John is dead. John's dad arrives home, and Rose finally fixes the bathroom by patching up the holes in the floor, costing 4 build grist, but leaving the toilet still in the yard for John's father to see on his trip to the back door because the front door was blocked. If she was hoping to go unnoticed, she failed. John tells Rose about the meteor, and she replies that the walkthrough vaguely suggests an impending threat before they end, and that if the meteor is a game construct, then the only thing to do is to proceed, and to try to solve the dilemma on the game's terms. The possibility that the meteor isn't a game construct is never brought up. Once again, where are these writers getting this information? The fact that Rose says the threat is vague means that a meteor wasn't mentioned specifically. But why would these guides not mention a meteor if they knew about it? Alternatively, how would they know of a threat if they didn't find out about a meteor? As a next step, Rose suggests using the pre-punched card with the lathe. She also states that she will write her own walkthrough for the game. That's when John answers Dave's message. Dave starts by talking about the bunny he gave John, describing himself as wife-beatery. He is referring to the tank top-like shirt that Nick Cage wears in Con Air, but someone who doesn't know about that type of clothing will be very confused about the wording. The reason he knew John had the present is because Jade told him, as we will see in the coming acts. John thanks him for the gift, but explains the situation. Dave replies by asking how big the meteor is. John says he has no idea, but has to go. With this format, it's hard to show jokes, as retelling it would ruin the punchline. As a result, most of the small gags I've had to skip over. This page contains my favorite joke in the act, which involves Dave commenting on how the size of a meteor wouldn't affect the reaction of the listener. I'll just put it on screen, and then continue. After placing the pre-punched card in the lathe, he now needs a totem, which is another word for the cruxite. The totem lathe carves the totem using the hole pattern found on the inserted card. John leaves to go to the balcony where he left the cruxite, just in time to see his dad puzzle over the bathtub. We then get an update on the bathroom situation. Rose has moved the cake to the pogo ride and then moves the toilet back to the bathroom. This action costs 0 build grist, and the 2 times in the future she will move the bathtub, it also costs nothing. So it seems that you can move whatever you want, but if it's attached to something, it costs build grist.
Keep this in mind for Act 2. On John's way back to his room, we see his dad just leave the bathtub where it is and go back to cook some more.
Why he isn't demanding answers from John is beyond me. Is his dad okay with this? Does he even know what's going on right now? John goes to the totem lathe and inserts the cruxite. The lathe carves it into an odd shape based on the previously inserted pre-punched card. Very small problem here. The pre-punched card is pink here, when it should be red like in the previous pages. John then reports back to Rose. Something I like is that John refers to the alchemeter as the alchemixer. John has only read this name once before, so it makes sense he doesn't remember it perfectly. It's a nice bit of realism. The same thing happens later when he calls build grist building jewels. Sadly, Rose can't answer, as on the way to place the bathtub back, she loses connection once more, leaving the bathtub blocking the door to John's room, trapping him inside. None of this would have happened if John didn't Chapchalogue the cake and merge it with another for no given reason. But John's door isn't even in the direction of the bathroom. Why would Rose be carrying it towards his room? Rose also knows that a meteor is heading towards John's house. Rather than helping him, she is still trying to fix the bathroom. Also, this wouldn't have happened if Rose put the bathtub in the backyard, which is right outside the bathroom. Instead, she decided to move it to the other side of the house onto the driveway. And if she had moved the bathtub back first, there wouldn't have been an issue either. But we don't get anything to explain her actions. Also, it sure is unlucky that she lost connection at that exact moment. A second before or after wouldn't have caused a problem. So we leave John with only 2 minutes until the meteor strikes his house, and we are finally introduced to our second of around 20 or so major characters. A young lady stands in her room. Due to a violent storm, her house has just lost power, along with her wireless internet connection. This severed her link to a popular video game she was playing with a young man at a critical moment. That young man is relying on this young lady to re-establish the connection somehow. So, we finally meet Rose in the flesh, and her introduction is similar to John. Like with John, the first name suggestion is a joke, calling her Flighty Broad. But then she is officially named Rose Lalonde. Something to note is that Rose's birthday isn't April 13th like John. It's December 4th. So why is Rose being named right now? Well, she isn't. If you look at the wording, unlike John, this name is retroactive. She was already named Rose before we met her, but it's safe to assume that she was named on her 13th birthday like John. Also just like John, we are shown her room and given a description of her. It states that she enjoys creative writing, something that we will see a lot of. She has a passion for rather obscure literature, and the beastly, strange, and fictitious, which refers to her fascination with the horror terrors. We'll get more information about that in the coming acts. She likes to dabble in psychoanalysis, something we have already seen and will see more of. And finally, she likes to knit, something we can see on her bed, and like others, will be explained later on. Like John's, this description could be removed. Unlike John, her chum handle, Tentacle Therapist, matches her interests. But John's chum handle is explained later. The room design is just as good as before. We can see some of her interests that were mentioned earlier. Rose takes what little time she has left before her friend's death to mess around in her room. First of all, after the narrator asks about the purple box, she hides it, which makes no sense, as she has no knowledge of them. Then she is commanded to writhe like a flagellum and puke on her bed, but she refuses. This is similar to the joke about the mailbox. It has no setup, and the tone doesn't match, as it should be tense, as John is about to die. Although that criticism could be said about this whole scene. Then she kicks her journals under the bed, for the same reason she was hiding the purple box. Finally, she wastes 40 seconds playing her violin. This page is similar to John playing the piano, but John was not in a hurry when he played the piano. He didn't know there was a meteor heading towards his house, unlike Rose. As if to remind us of all the time we're wasting, we cut back to John kissing his movie posters goodbye. Does Rose just not care about John? Because she seems to think she has a lot of time to spare. Finally, Rose gets going. She captchalogues her knitting bag and violin, because she needs them for some reason, and we are introduced to our third kind of fetch modus, tree. The tree modus works based off of a root card, which is the first item captchalogued. It sorts the cards by comparing the first letter of each item. When a new card is inserted, it looks at the current card it's overlapping, which is initially the root card. If the new item's first letter comes before the first letter of the card it overlaps, the card will move to the left. If not, it will move to the right. If there's a card in that position, the process will repeat, and the cycle will continue until it finds an empty spot to place itself. This is never explained to the audience, beyond saying it is sorted alphabetically, and must be inferred by observing its actions. I, among many others, didn't understand the function of this modus on a first reading due to this poor explanation. But let's put this on pause for a moment, because we haven't been shown the true colors of this modus. Rose looks out the window for an establishing shot. We see a laboratory beyond a line of trees, and a mausoleum housing Rose's dead cat Jasper's. Rose interpreted this gesture of building a mausoleum by her mother as scornful irony in retrospect. She believes that the laboratory is sending out a powerful Wi-Fi signal, and that if she can get to the observatory, she can reconnect with John. Before we leave, there's one last thing we need to do. Rose picks up the grimoire for summoning the zoologically dubious, because she needs that for some reason. The grimoire for summoning the zoologically dubious has the word grimoire on the spine. I sure hope she doesn't have another type of grimoire, or this would be confusing. After leaving the room, we see that Rose's mother has a strong liking for wizards, which Rose perceives as ironic, as she believes her mother is only displaying these paintings to bother her. As Rose makes her way around the corner, she stops at a junction. Illuminated by a lightning flash, we see the silhouette of Rose's mother. For reasons that make no sense, her mother is completely invisible without the lightning, even though everything in the hallway is plain to see. Once she moves to the other side, the lightning strikes again and the woman is gone. Rose makes it to the observatory, which requires an outdoor walkway. Once inside, she removes the laptop from her Sylladex, and we see why this modus is so terrible. Rose can only access the root card, which is the first card she puts in. All other cards are inaccessible, so it's similar to a queue. You only have access to the oldest item. And to be clear, because I fear people might disagree, in Act 3, Rose finds a way to switch modes on her modus. On that page, it says, "Looks like you can choose between picking leaves or awkwardly uprooting the whole tree as you've been doing," proving she can only access the root at this point in time. Now there is a way to move items around inside the tree, and that is auto-balancing, where the tree shifts to be more balanced. However, controlling this is very difficult. A tree is considered unbalanced if one side is 2 rows taller than the other. So let's look at a simple example. My phone is ringing, and it isn't in the tree, but luckily I only have 2 other items in there. It should be simple to get it out, right? I insert the phone, creating a perfectly balanced tree. How many items do we need to put in to get the phone to the top? You might say 2, to quickly create 2 extra rows, but that is incorrect, because of subtrees. Each item is the root of its own subtree. So this is a subtree, and so is this. For a tree to be balanced, every subtree must also be balanced. By adding 2 items like this, the phone becomes the root of an unbalanced subtree, which causes an autobalance, the result of which pushes the phone even further down. So we need to fill the tree, so that the only time there is an autobalance is when it moves the item we want upwards. So we find 2 items that won't cause an autobalance, and after adding a third, the root is now unbalanced, but the phone subtree isn't, causing the root to autobalance, moving the phone upwards. Congratulations, you now have access to your phone, and it only required you to more than double the number of items in your Sylladex. And that is for a simple tree. When you have more layers, you need to add more items. and every step upwards requires an auto balance. Consider how complicated this is to use. Not only do you have to calculate the optimal items to insert, but you also have to make sure you have those items around you when you need them. And this will happen dozens or maybe even hundreds of times a day. This is very, very inconvenient. Of course, this brings up another issue, with the exception of when you put an item into an empty tree. For every item you take out, you have to put more than one item in. How do you get the extra items out? You would think that you would remove the root and the tree would auto-balance, but that's not how this thing works, because if you remove the root card, the tree doesn't auto-balance, the tree is severed, and all items in it fall to the ground. This changes things, except for times where the only item in your Sylladex is the one that you wish to use. Every time you use an item, something will fall out, even if you are an auto-balance master, and you can get the item you want to the top, everything else will still fall out. This ruins the whole point of the Modus. The only difference between the root card and everything else is that the root card is in your hand, and everything else falls to the ground. Every item will be removed every time, and the only reason you would mess around with the auto-balancing is if making an item fall on the ground isn't something you want. As a result, you can never have more than one fragile item in your Sylladex at once, because even if you catch one, the other will fall and break. And good luck not having your stuff get stolen when you answer your phone while walking through a crowd. I can't see any reason anyone would use this Modus. It goes against itself. It's not a challenge on whether or not you can make the root card what you want. It's a challenge of preventing all of your belongings from breaking. This is many times worse than the Q Modus. No one in their right mind would use this. We are never given a reason for Rose using this, besides her saying it is elegant. But despite its elegance, she still shows an agitated expression almost every time the tree is severed. Maybe she is using it because she lost a bet, or maybe she's trying to sound cool in front of her friends. But if so, it needs to be said, because otherwise it makes Rose look like an utter buffoon. Rose decides to spend a little more time not saving her friend to look through the telescope, in which she can see meteors flying through the clouds. For a telescope that's purpose is to see into space, it sure can zoom out a lot. There are clouds at the edge of her view. Why would anybody build a telescope that big that can see something this close? Finally, Rose uses her laptop, placing it on the grimoire to give it extra elevation.
It's almost as if Rose is trying to put off saving John for as long as she can.
Rose opens her laptop, and she has her web browser open. Her desktop background is a woman holding a parasol, with her legs replaced with tentacles, a reference to the horror terrors, I presume. Rose connects to a Wi-Fi signal called SN_lab0413. An observant reader will remember that Sburb was created by Skynet, so this SN lab might be related to them. It's also another reference to the comic's beginning date. Rose reconnects to John and we have 41 seconds remaining. But is that accurate? Did Rose only take 1 minute and 29 seconds to reconnect? Well, I can't tell you exactly, but there is something you can measure. As you've probably noticed, almost every page of Homestuck is a GIF. And if I was to string all the GIFs together, you'll get, drumroll please, 1 minute and 54.05 seconds. 34 seconds over the time the comic says. It would be longer, but it ignores everything that happened in between pages. This is a blatant disregard for continuity. All they needed to do was increase the time. But if they did that, then the initial time on the Cruxtruder wouldn't have been a meme. Now that I think about it, and by that I mean now is a good time to ask, did they really only take 2 minutes and 3 seconds to do all that stuff between the Colonel arriving and Rose losing connection? Well, totaling up the GIFs, we have 1 minute and 33 seconds, leaving at most 30 seconds between pages. That's cutting it very close, even if we assume that they ran between the pages and all chats were instant. Rose reconnects and John is panicking, but she calmly explains that despite the GameFAQs not having any information on what happens next, they still have the totem that was just carved, so they should at least try that. Rose removes the door, which uses up their last 2 build grist, and places the bathtub back where it belongs. After removing the perfectly generic objects from the Alchemitor and adding them to the Finalia registry, the totem is scanned and a blue tree briefly appears to grow John an apple. So now we know the basic process of alchemy. You get Cruxite from the Cruxtruder. You use a punched card to carve the Cruxite with the totem lathe, and the alchemitor scans the carved cruxite to make an object at the expense of grist. Next act, we will find out how to create the punched cards. I really like this animation. I think that the music fits it very well, building up to the meteor impact. You see the reactions of everyone in the house, including several pictures. The only issue I have is that once again the time remaining doesn't match. With the 15 seconds of GIFs and 5 seconds of the animation before the timer appears, it should say 20 seconds, not 30. But this isn't anything new. There's also the question on why John took so long to bite the apple. Nevertheless, it's good the act landed on a high note. So, Act 1 is complete, and although it's only part way through the story, in fact, when it comes to word count, we are only 1.5% of the way through. Nevertheless, I feel there are still conclusions to be made on this act. After all, this is the introduction to Homestuck. So let's start with the characters. Of the characters introduced in this act, John is by far the most developed. Through these pages, we learn about his love for Colonel Sassacre, and how John looks up to him. Colonel Sassacre's daunting text of magical frivolity and practical japery is John's standard for humor, and he mimics the Colonel's actions. But underneath this humorous exterior lies gloom. Despite him having a great life, at least in comparison to his friends as we will see in the coming acts, when John looks around his neighborhood he feels lost, as if something is missing. This might be why his song of choice on the piano isn't something upbeat and jovial, but one of melancholy. And he looks towards Sburb as a possible escape to something more exciting. He has a contentious relationship with his father, although it's more due to the angst of a 13-year-old boy rather than any true malice. But although John's character is set up rather well in this act, it isn't without issues. John does a lot of really stupid things in this act, such as him not knowing what a Sylladex is or how to use it, him believing his disguise will fool his father, and him forgetting how to place things down. I honestly have to question his sanity. Is he okay? Should he see a doctor? While we are talking about John, it's a good time to talk about his dad. His dad will never get a line of dialogue in this whole story, so we can only judge him from what other people say about him or the actions we see him do. He has a strong love for baking, to the extent that on John's birthday he bakes 4 cakes that we see, enough that he had to go to the store because he ran out of supplies. He also seems to have an obsession with clowns. We can conclude that his dad has a bit of an eccentric personality, going to extreme extents to show his love for his son. But paradoxically, he is willing to leave his son alone in the house without a word, which seems contradictory. But beyond this, it's hard to say much more. We'll just have to wait. Let's go on to Rose. Although we only see her in person at the end of the act, we still learn a lot about her. Rose has an interest in psychology, enough that John seems sick of being analyzed by her. From her actions as the server player, she is shown to be very impulsive. Despite every attempt to fix the bathroom making things worse, she continued to try to fix it. She does have a creative streak. She has a fondness for knitting, as seen by the state of her room, and the knitting projects that are scattered around it. She also dabbles in writing, as seen by her journals, and the intention to write her own game FAQ guide. Similar to John, she has a negative relationship with her mother, who we only get a small glimpse of. However, from what Rose says, her mother appears to be an alcoholic. Still, we don't have much more than that. Overall, we have a solid foundation for her character, but there are some issues with some of the choices she makes, such as the time she took to regain internet connection, her choice in using the tree modus, and everything to do with the bathroom, which we will talk about soon. On to Dave. We only get a few conversations from him, but from this we can see he has some shared interests with John, at least to the point where he watches some of the movies John likes. We will see much more of him in Act 2. Jade was basically absent from the story, beyond 2 short conversations. Yet in this time there is some stuff to look forward to, such as the explosion outside her house. She will slowly become more relevant in the next act, and will be focused on in Act 3.
Overall, the characters aren't looking good. Rose and John are a mix of good setups and stupid decisions, and we don't really have enough information on everyone else. Now let's talk about plot progression. So far, Homestuck's story is very straightforward. The first half is John searching for the Sburb discs. This shows us every room in John's house, with the exception of his father's bedroom and the laundry room we would see in the second half. Through John's interactions with his surroundings, we get to better understand him. The second half is mostly him reacting to what Rose is doing in his house, which is aided by us already seeing all the rooms. In this half, we better understand Rose's character. It's also where we learn about some of the basics of Sburb, which I argue is well implemented.
In a short time, we learn the basic functions of the server player, and 3 of the 4 major machines. But there's still a lot left to be discovered, like what the kernel sprite is, and why the game summoned a meteor. Despite what I've been saying about the plot, we can't forget about all the nonsense that takes place in it. The moment you look at it beyond surface level, you see its true nature. Alright, it's time to talk about world building. What is the difference between our Earth and Homestuck's? They have some of the same movies, and GameFAQs exist. Yet, the existence of the Sylladex would greatly alter history. Being able to transport large quantities of goods while taking up no space would change so much. Especially when we find out you can put living things inside of it. Think about it, you could hide a whole army in your pocket. The cars in this world wouldn't be shaped like ours, because a trunk isn't needed. Imagine how easily you could steal things. The fact that this world is so similar to our own doesn't make any sense. But considering how little of the story will take place on Earth, taking a lot of time to explain everything would be a waste, because most of the events take place inside the game of Sburb. So the best thing to do is to remove the need for explanation. Just avoid any references to our Earth, so that little explanation will be needed. Also, why is it called the Sburb Beta if it's the final version? Now let's talk about the Sylladex again. The Sylladex as a base mechanic is fine. I have no issue with characters having inventories based on data structures. I'm fine with the queue and tree modus existing, but considering how inconvenient they are, we need a good reason for them to be used. And then we have the unexplained rules, such as the direction things fly and what it means to use something. If the Sylladex was nothing more than a magic backpack with a modus that gives it extra rules, I would be perfectly fine with it. In fact, that's how it will be after Act 2. I'll also talk briefly about the humor again. Humor is one of the biggest reasons to read Homestuck. There is a joke on basically every page. I don't have problems with the jokes in this act beyond the few I've mentioned. In fact, I like quite a bit of them, so if there's any reason to read this act after you're done watching this video, it's for that. I'll talk about the art for a bit. Homestuck was drawn to be produced very fast, with assets being reused constantly. Whether the style causes problems for you will differ from person to person, but one weakness of the constant reusing of assets is facial expressions. Despite John experiencing mind-breaking stuff, he seems totally unfazed most of the time. Luckily, it goes away in the coming acts, and the art becomes more detailed. Homestuck's Act 1 is bad. Really bad. I would dare say it might be the worst part of Homestuck. Everything good is completely overshadowed by all the contrivances and plot holes. There is no excuse for the story turning out this way. It's not like Andrew Hussie didn't care about logic. He put in many pages explaining how Sburb and the Sylladex works, but the explanations were either lacking or contained flaws. And Andrew Hussie either didn't notice the problems, or if he did, he didn't care. To think that this is what every reader would experience at first. So many people must have given up on the story not even a 100th of the way through. I don't blame them. I would love to ask myself years ago why I continued. I might not have done so if I read it today, but I'm glad I continued. Because the story does get good, but of course I can't say that conclusively with just this video. So I guess I should answer the question, will I be making more videos for the rest of Homestuck? When I look back at the making of this video, I can't help but sigh. Originally,
I was going to write the script for the entirety of Homestuck before recording a single video, but the scope of the project continued to increase as time went on. Eventually, after scaling the project back several times, I decided to focus on finishing Act 1 and to see what happens from there. To my shock, this video ended up taking 6 months to make. And considering that Act 1 is 1% of the whole story, I'm sure it won't surprise you when I say I'm not going to continue critiquing Homestuck. I don't want to spend decades on this. But beyond that, I don't want YouTube to be my job. My passions lie elsewhere. And considering the current trend of the Homestuck fanbase, I doubt I could make a living from this even if I wanted to. So when I decided that this video would probably be my last, a harrowing thought came to mind. It was that I failed in my goal. I wanted to make a video series that would analyze Homestuck to determine its quality. Instead, I made a video pointing out how bad the first 1% of the story is. Releasing the video as it is now would only damage the already dying fanbase. No one would read Homestuck after watching this video. It was to the point where I considered dropping the video, which was already complete and unlisted on YouTube. But I didn't want all this work to lead to nothing, so I decided to add one more section to the end of it. My attempt to convince you to read Homestuck. Homestuck absolutely fell flat on its face with this act, to the point where I'm sure that most of the people who dropped the comic did so before Act 2 even started. Homestuck Act 1 is the story of a boy struggling against nonsensical world building and his own stupidity, but the rest of Homestuck quickly throws that to the side. Homestuck is a multimedia event. People call it a webcomic, but that doesn't do it justice. There are multiple hours worth of animations in this series. Some are fast-paced and bombastic, like Jade Enter, while the others are slow and reverent, like John Rise Up. You have the 13-minute-long Cascade that crashed 3 separate websites when it was released. An animation that crowned the first half of Homestuck with its quick action and many payoffs. Then you have the professionally animated spectacle that crowned the last half. You also have many hours of games, ranging from walk around an environment and talk, to simpler point and click. And this isn't to mention the music. There is a lot of music. Hundreds of tracks, some of which were even made by Toby Fox. That's right, Undertale fans. Homestuck had Megalovania before it was cool. But of course, that's just the medium in which the story was told. Without substance, it is worthless. So let me tell you what Homestuck is about in greater detail, while still not spoiling more than I feel I must. Homestuck is about the world of Sburb, a template world many beings have found themselves in throughout all of time and space, one with its own personalized planetary system. Our heroes are told what they must do to win, yet at the same time they are told it's impossible to do so. The game was rigged from the start, and the ultimate prize is impossible to obtain. Homestuck is a story that sets up an elaborate game, with complex rules and mechanics that could lead to many interesting stories, but Homestuck isn't one of those stories. Homestuck is a story about understanding those rules and finding ways to break them. And the biggest tool for this story is its unique time travel system. Homestuck's time travel is complex, yet consistent, involving multiple universes and timelines, a system where time paradoxes are essential and frequent, to the point where the story takes place in paradox space. While most stories use time travel as a deus ex machina, often in unexplained and lazy ways, Homestuck isn't like that at all. Its rules are well defined, and it thrives within the limitations it gives itself. Every plot point in the story relates to it in some way. As an example, the story mainly follows 2 groups of characters, the humans and the trolls. The trolls have the ability to communicate with others at any point in their timeline. Carcat, for example, starts by talking to John at the end of the timeline. Then, he jumps backwards several times until he talks to John at the beginning, so that Carcat's 5th conversation with John is John's first conversation with him. This leads to a unique non-linear story, but it never goes too far. The timelines are easy enough to keep track of. A lot of time is spent exploring why characters think the way they do. The characters are one of the strongest points in the series, and the way that they view time travel leads to many different situations. In a world where the future could be considered deterministic, do our choices even matter? Should one feel guilty for doing something bad if the consequences for breaking destiny are even worse? But besides the drama, Homestuck has its comedy. However, comedy is hard to explain. So instead, I'm going to play a bunch of uncensored, out-of-context moments I particularly enjoy from the amazing dub by Voxus. But before that, I have one last thing to say. If you do decide to read Homestuck, and you should, don't forget to use the unofficial collection. You will not regret it. Thank you so much for watching. Perhaps we'll meet again in another video if my passion sparks once more. But for now, I bid you all farewell.
The dignitary is one of your superiors who makes you nervous. The list of superiors who makes you nervous in fact includes all of your superiors. It includes many of your inferiors as well.
When I am finished with this minor interruption, we will resume our gentlemanly negotiation. I will proceed to beat you severely until you agree to do what I ask. I trust you won't take it personally. Now, please excuse me. I have to talk to a teenage girl from another universe.
Oh no! Dave?
What? What is it?
Dave, this poor bird.
What bird?
The one with the sword through it.
I wouldn't know anything about that.
But isn't this your sword?
That could be anyone's sword. What does it look like? Is it a cheap piece of shit? Because I only bother with high-quality blades, forged by stoic Asian masters. Hell's a rude kinds of expensive.
You are not their leader. You are their friend. There is a big difference. You prepare to issue your party a highly authoritative series of friendly requests. Now, John, bid farewell. Godspeed, heroes. You have all the faith in the world that they will be successful. As a friend leader, or sometimes known as a pal honcho, you have done an amazing job. You have come up with a plan and politely request-ordered your loyal team to execute it. It is all falling into place perfectly. You are quite sure that you have not failed to account for even a single thing.
John, I'm worried about Rose. John? Oh God, please don't tell me your computer was in the wall you just gave that guy. Damn it, John! One of these days you will learn the value of having plenty of backup computers. Yeah, you're never gonna read this, are you?
Ugh. There he goes again. Bothering you. He is so impatient. He's just going to have to hold his stupid, angry alien space horses. Carcat cannot be conveyed with a more detailed portrait yet. He is too angry, and is forced to look like shit.
John, it's me again.
Who? Oh, that's right. The lead-speaking blind one. Go away!
John, don't make fun of my handicap.
Which one? The blindness or the lead-speak?
I am sensitive about both.
Now, Andrew Hussey, retire to study.
I retire to my heavily processed photograph of Andrew Carnegie's study, painstakingly retrieved from a Google image search.
Andrew Hussey, greet Miss Paint.
Miss Paint, you are doing a wonderful job. Thank you. It was also very thoughtful of you to switch the layer mode of your coat of paint to the overlay setting so it would not obscure the details of Mr. Carnegie's lavish room.
Bathtub, level up for slaying the imp. The bathtub surges heroically and surpasses the rung, Archimedes' Aqua Cradle, proceeding directly to the vaunted rung, Taft Jammer. The tub makes off with a cool 490 boon dollars. The tub's basin capacity remains unaffected. Safe, level up for slaying the imp. The safe was slain in battle. A great flaming nautical pyre carries it off to Valhalla.
Suddenly, the whole vault room was shaking. You wonder what it could be. It sounds suspiciously like Kansas about to plow through the wall Kool-Aid Man style. You pray to God that it's not Cans about to plow through the wall Kool-Aid Man style. All of a sudden, Cans plows through the wall Kool-Aid Man style. Diamond's Droog. Resist urge to shout, oh yeah. Oh no!
Hey, wait.
These darn birds are in the way. What are they doing in your apartment anyway? Also, they're adorable.
I always keep birds in here. It's sort of my thing. I'm training to be a lame, gothy supervillain.
Now, tidy up Strider's apartment a little. What the apartment needs is a woman's touch. You grab a towel you found lying around and dampen it with water from the toilet. This is how ordinary people clean ordinary houses, right? Oops, you dropped it.
You wheel over to your favorite poster featuring Pupa Pan, which is your favorite thing. You have always fantasized that one day intrepid young Pupa would come and take you away, and together you would fly to a beautiful paradise planet of legend that has all sorts of fanciful stuff like pirates, treasure, a cruel villain with a missing arm and a missing eye, and those weird aliens called Indians. You have left your window open since you were very young, just in case Pupa stopped by one night and decided to splash a pinch of special stardust in your face. You have had this interest far prior to your accident. Being paralyzed isn't what made you want to be able to fly. That would be dumb and would make no sense. Being paralyzed does sort of make you want to be able to walk, though.
Introduce yourself to the local amphibious fauna.
I am a secret wizard. Behold my robes.
Behold robes? You wonder what the hell a secret wizard is. This guy is making you a little nervous. You don't think you'll ask him for your bedsheet back.
Converse.
I have renamed myself Crumpo Hat. I have dishonored my ancestors beyond comprehension with this frivolous accessory.
Squirrel is the human word for nut creature.
Oh.